and welcome back. Today, the way back to Mayberry, we are reading from chapter 9, and the chapter is titled Tomorrow. And the scripture reading that goes along with it is Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. Today's reading talks about the episode Opie's Hobo Friend. One reason that the episode of Opie's Hobo Friend stands out in my mind is that actor Buddy Ebsen plays the hobo. Most of us remember Buddy Ebsen as Jed Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies, as well as his starring role in Barnaby Jones. In this appearance, Buddy turns in a very believable performance as the hobo who ends up having quite an effect on young Opie. Andy and Opie meet the hobo, who identifies himself as David Brown, while fishing one day. Later on, Barney runs Mr. Dave in for vagrancy, but Andy doesn't want to needlessly hassle the man. Andy offers Mr. Dave a temporary job trimming the hedges around his house. The more Opie gets to know Mr. Dave, the more impressed he becomes. You see, Mr. Dave is not like anyone else Opie has ever known. He doesn't have a regular place to live, and he doesn't have a job. But to Opie, Mr. Dave seems to be having the time of his life. In one scene, Mr. Dave shows Opie that he doesn't need money to get gumballs from the machine. He just needs to know the magic word. Tuscarora! Mr. Dave shouts, and sure enough, a gumball appears from the machine. What Opie doesn't know is that Mr. Dave has jimmied the machine from the back. Mr. Dave explains that this is not stealing because the machine doesn't want or need the gumball. Therefore, it's okay for Opie to have as many gumballs as he wants. Later, at the Taylor house, Mr. Dave and Opie are deciding just how the shrubs should be trimmed. Mr. Dave suggests several approaches, including a formal shape similar to that of Buckingham Palace, or maybe an oriental design which would include the creation of animal shapes. Opie reminds Mr. Dave that his paw usually just lops off the tops. During this discussion, Mr. Dave pretends to be interrupted by a fish that just jumped in the lake miles away. Opie is incredulous that Mr. Dave can hear the fish from such a distance, but Mr. Dave explains his talent by telling Opie that he is part Indian. Mr. Dave suggests that they leave the shrubs and go fishing because tomorrow is the perfect day to start any job. Opie begins to believe that the hobo life is the way to go. You can do whatever you want whenever you want, and there are no apparent consequences. This attitude begins to affect Opie as he lets his household chores go, and is even picked up by Barney for missing school. Finally, Andy has enough of this behavior and decides to pay a visit to Mr. Dave down by the train tracks. Andy explains that he is concerned because Opie has begun to imitate Mr. Dave's way of life. Mr. Dave again touts the advantages of his lifestyle and tells Andy that he should let Opie decide what type of life is best for him. Andy reminds Mr. Dave that Opie is just a child, and that he will grab at the first shiny thing with ribbons on it. But by the time he finds out that there is a hook, it will be too late. Mr. Dave doesn't argue with Andy and offers to leave town, which in Mr. Dave's mind will solve Andy's problem. Andy reminds Mr. Dave that his problems have just begun. Andy has a lot of unscrambling to do because Opie still thinks that Mr. Dave hung the moon. Looking back on the story, Mr. Dave has an interesting view of life. He prides himself on living by his wits, and he doesn't care if he has to bend the law a little bit now and then to make ends meet. He has developed a lifestyle that suits him just fine, and he seems to be very happy. Characteristic of the series, this episode provides many lessons, from Opie's impressionable nature to Andy's struggle to raise his son the best way he knows how. However, I believe Mr. Dave provides us a few lessons as well. I doubt it was easy being a hobo back in those days. I'm sure Mr. Dave met several Barneys who wanted to throw him in jail or run him out of town simply because he didn't fit into the current society. Amid his troubles, though, Mr. Dave seems pretty content. Nothing really bothers him too much, and he seems rather proud of himself for living the life that other men only dream of. However, a couple of things about Mr. Dave were all too familiar to me. One is his rationalization. Have you ever noticed how rationalizing a situation gets easier each time you do it? The first time you are faced with doing something you know is wrong, it can be difficult to rationalize to yourself why it would be okay to go ahead and do it. But the second time you face that same choice, it becomes a little easier. Each subsequent time you are presented with the same situation, it becomes easier and easier to rationalize why you are justified in your decision. I believe that's what happened to Mr. Dave. Obviously, Mr. Dave knew that breaking the law was wrong. But think about the scene at the gumball machine. He had rationalized to himself and to Opie that stealing was okay. He thought it was fine to break the law now and then as long as it provided him the means to take care of himself. I know that I can be guilty of the same behavior. I may not steal to get out of working for a living, but I can just as easily rationalize my errant behavior as long as my attitude is focused on serving myself. The second characteristic of Mr. Dave that hit home was his procrastination. Remember the scene at the porch when Mr. Dave states that tomorrow is the perfect day to start any job? Mr. Dave had gotten pretty good at putting off the task at hand, so much so that you didn't even realize what he was doing until he was already gone. In the past, whenever I thought about procrastination, being lazy immediately came to mind. But I don't believe you have to be lazy to procrastinate. I know that in my case, several factors can cause me to put off the things I know I should do. For me, fear is a powerful detractor from my productivity. Fear of rejection, fear that my abilities won't suffice, fear that no matter how hard I try, I won't succeed. These are all very real feelings that can take away from the things I try to accomplish. In the end, Mr. Dave realizes the negative effect he is having on Opie. He decides to help Andy out by stealing an old purse belonging to Aunt Bee. A purse she has recently thrown out in the trash. When Barney brings Mr. Dave in on charges of theft, Opie just can't believe it. Even Opie knows that Aunt Bee's purse is where she keeps the money to buy food for the family. Opie's opinion of Mr. Dave is dashed, and he even gives back the intricate fishing lure that Mr. Dave had given him earlier. The crushed look on Opie's face tells the whole story. He finally sees the true consequences of such a lifestyle. Andy realizes what Mr. Dave has done and is appreciative that he came back to set things straight. However, Mr. Dave is reluctant to take any credit for his actions. He doesn't apologize for his lifestyle, but he does try to honor Andy's wishes to raise his son as he sees fit. I often wonder if Mr. Dave's experience with Opie caused him to rethink his lifestyle. Did he worry about the example that he was setting, or did he continue to be concerned only with his own happiness? Did it cause him to stop and think about all the things he could accomplish if he would just incorporate responsibility into his life? Or did he go along his merry way, drifting from one day to the next? Yes, this episode makes me think about my example to those who look up to me. but it also makes me think about my personal attitude toward my own life. Like Mr. Dave, am I competent to drift from one situation to another, or just to live off my wits? Or am I prepared to make my life count, to define my goals, and to work hard to realize those goals? It's a tough choice to make because it's tempting to take the easy road. When you consider the stakes involved, however, the right choice is obvious. Thank you for joining me. Can't wait to see you next week.